Well, hello and welcome to the second edition of Symphonic Literature COVID edition. Today we're going to talk about the great Russian composer Peter Ilyich Tchaikovsky. Tchaikovsky lived from 1840 until 1893, passing away actually tragically just after the premiere of arguably his greatest work, his Sixth Symphony, the Pathétique. Tchaikovsky lived a very troubled life. He experienced over the course of his lifetime three great tragedies, the first of which actually occurred at the age of 10 when he was sent over 800 miles away from his home and separated from his mother in order to attend boarding school, and she tragically died just a few years later of a bout with cholera. Tchaikovsky himself had shown great promise as a musician as a young man, but in Russia at that time, the only possible occupation for a musician would be that of a teacher or being a theater musician. And actually, theater musicians were considered among the lowest class of people within Russia at this time. He was actually trained as a civil servant and then was taken under the wing of Anton Rubinstein, the great composer and pianist, Russian pianist, who brought him into the Russian Musical Society and also welcomed him into the inaugural class for the St. Petersburg Conservatory in 1862. He was part of the first graduating class. And this was an institution that was very much at odds with other developments that were going on within musical Russia. There's a group of composers, many of whom were actually amateur composers, called the Mighty Handful, and this was a group that was overseen by Balakirev, but most famously involved Rimsky-Korsakov, master of great Russian orchestration, as well as Modest Mussorgsky, probably most famous for his pictures as an exhibition as orchestrated by Maurice Ravel in the next century. And the Mighty Handful felt that Russian music needed to reflect its own ideals, and the idea of the teaching that Tchaikovsky was receiving at the hands of Rubinstein was very much opposed to this. It espoused Western ideals, idea of development of the prominent genres such as the symphony, were things that were largely rejected by the Handful, but very much reflected the training that Tchaikovsky himself had experienced. And what we find is by 1872, he writes a work. This is actually his second symphony. The first one was the Winter Dreams Symphony, and the Symphony Number 2, which has the nickname Little Russian, and that's not referring to a person of small stature. It's referring to the area that we now think of as the Ukraine, which as part of Russia was considered Little Russia. And the work reflects a new approach to form and cohesion that would put Tchaikovsky in a place that was both respected by the Mighty Handful, for reasons I'll talk about in just a moment, but also was able to bridge, at least in some regards, to some of the ideas of symphonic development and form that would be more familiar to people such as Brahms and other contemporaries over in Europe at that point in time. Now, I should mention that this period, 1872, really the 1870s into the 1880s were some of the most prolific in Tchaikovsky's career and resulted in some of his works that are the most played today. His violin concerto from 1878, the first piano concerto from 1875. We also have the evolution of the Romeo and Juliet fantasy overture, three different versions from 1870 all the way up to 1880, and of course the mighty 1812 overture, a piece he actually came to almost detest, which he completed in 1880. But all of these reflect some of this development and growth that came out of the Symphony Number 2. So what I'd like to do is start with a little bit of a listening to an excerpt from the beginning of the finale of the Second Symphony, the Little Russian Symphony, a work that was really idealized by no less of a composer than Igor Stravinsky later on. Here's a little bit of that introduction to the finale. So after a very grand opening, we have the first of what will eventually feel like hundreds of statements of a Ukrainian folk song that are going to be passed around the orchestra or heard by each of the different families. To many, it sounds, myself included, it becomes very repetitive and difficult to relate, particularly when we think of works of Beethoven or Brahms, as we listened to in the first installment of these vlogs. But what's important to understand is that Tchaikovsky, by using Russian folk material, or in this case Ukrainian folk material, he's actually developing in a way that we would not normally think of as development. And what I mean by that is, if we were to think of the beginning of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony with its famous ba-ba-ba-ba, and the fact that that is used to then develop a much longer melody, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that gives us the idea for the third movement of the same work, ra-ba-ba-bum, ra-ba-ba-bum, or move forward into the works of Brahms, as we saw with the last one, where in an introduction he's able to present all of the material that will then unfold over the course of a sonata allegro form movement. Well, what Tchaikovsky is doing is saying, rather than development simply be a matter of using pitches or rhythms or a combination of those two, what if we were to look at orchestration or color, musical color, timbre, and view that as something that could be developed as well. So by moving this, essentially the same melody around the orchestra, he was creating for himself a new sense of development. And this is where a lot of critics and a lot of musicologists really start to diverge on the craftsmanship of Tchaikovsky. I guess in retrospect I would say he's fusing some Russian ideals into almost the sorts of clothing that wasn't necessarily designed for. But it does explain a lot of the repetition that we'll hear with Tchaikovsky. So when it comes to form, Tchaikovsky was a master of miniature forms. His dance movements from the ballets, whether it's Nutcracker or Swan Lake, or the light dance movements from the symphonies, tend to be incredibly well crafted. It's a language that also lends itself very nicely to theme and variations, but it doesn't necessarily lend itself as well to large-scale forms, particularly a development form like sonata form. All right? I'd like to take a look at what makes Tchaikovsky's music so distinctive, and we're going to do that by looking at individual movements that come from the final three symphonies. Symphony number 4, 5, and 6 were, and still are, regarded as some of the finest examples of Russian Romanticism, and these are works that are still played with great regularity by orchestras all around the world. And in order to do that, we're going to look at two different tracks of ideas. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, Tchaikovsky, nothing is more important to Tchaikovsky than melody and beauty. As I mentioned in the Brahms vlog, American composer and trumpeter Tony Plogue talking about, Brahms said I could never write a note unless it was perfect, and Tchaikovsky said I could never write a note unless it was beautiful. Well, when we look at the different movements from the different symphonies, we start to see repetition of things. Four major things. These are four types of melodies that Tchaikovsky is going to use with great regularity throughout all of his mature works. Now, the first types of these actually has to do with beautiful lyric melodies, and these are long sweeping melodies having almost nothing to do with melodies that we might have heard from, say, Beethoven or the Viennese classicists. And in fact, these melodies are so complete by themselves that they don't lend themselves to any sort of traditional development, okay? And they also sort of limit him to being able to use these either in repetition or just move on to a new melody. So we're going to start with an excerpt from his last symphony, the Pathétique, Symphony number 6, which was written in 1893. And this is going to be very representative of one of these very beautiful lyrical melodies, and it's also going to deal with another very important trait of Tchaikovsky, and that's his orchestration. So as we look at these four different types of melodies, we're also going to explore a variety of facets in which Tchaikovsky's orchestrations were original or unique to him. So this is the beautiful melody in the middle of the first movement of the Sixth Symphony, and I want you to notice how the melody is played in octaves throughout the entire string section. Absolutely beautiful music, but as you can tell, there's really nothing more to do with that melody. It is complete by itself, and it doesn't provide the idea of small motives that could be turned into something larger. This was something that Tchaikovsky struggled with a great deal. The second type of melody that Tchaikovsky is particularly known for would be a march-like melody. And I think a great example of that would be in his Symphony number 5. This is the last movement. This work was written in 1888. And on the orchestration side of things, you're going to hear how Tchaikovsky separates the different families. We're going to hear an initial statement done by the strings, and then when that's done, he'll then move over to the brass choir, actually providing the second statement of the melody. This is the melody excerpt, a march style melody by Tchaikovsky from the Fifth Symphony finale. So again, a march-style melody by Tchaikovsky, one of the four types of melodies that he's so known for. Also, I'd point out at the very beginning of that excerpt, we heard a lot of scales. Scales are a very important transitional idea for Tchaikovsky, with examples of that throughout almost every movement of his symphonies. So we've heard a beautiful lyric melody, we've heard a march-like melody, and now we're going to look at a type of melody that naturally conjures up ideas or images of people dancing. And of course, Tchaikovsky's so famous for those ballet scores. There's also a beautiful waltz within the Serenade for Strings. We're going to listen to the very unusual waltz from the Sixth Symphony, and this is the second movement. And what's unusual, typically we would expect a scherzo or a waltz to be in 3. This one's actually going to be in 5. Now, you're going to hear a couple more things that I think are important to understand about Tchaikovsky. I don't think he gets enough credit as a composer of counterpoint. This idea of pairing together 2 or more lines of relatively equal importance. And part of the reason for that, I think he does it so effortlessly. At the very start of this example, you're going to hear the melody, and the second statement is accompanied by another line that comes in and out of focus, but is clearly separate and independent. This is an excerpt from the scherzo movement of the Pathétique Symphony No. 6. So again, a just delightful, if a little bit off-kilter sort of movement, because it's in 5 as opposed to 3. The last type of melody that we need to explore with Tchaikovsky is one that was very near and dear to his heart, but also to the mighty handful and Russian composers that would follow him, particularly Stravinsky, were drawn to Russian folk melodies. And Tchaikovsky would frequently use existing folk material, though on some occasions he would write new original melodies that sounded like they were actually folk melodies, not unlike Percy Grainger in the band world. We're going to listen to an excerpt from the beginning of the second movement of the Fourth Symphony, which was written in 1878, and we're going to turn our attention to that work in just a moment. This movement starts with a beautiful plaintive oboe solo, and it's accompanied by string pizzicato. Now, this is another orchestrational trend that we would see with Tchaikovsky, extensive use of pizzicato. In fact, the third movement of this symphony is largely written for the string section playing pizzicato. We're also going to hear more of this separation of the orchestral choirs, and we're going to hear a solo wind instrument in the form of the oboe, not playing particularly lowly, but that's something else I want to mention about Tchaikovsky's orchestrations, is that he routinely would score for woodwind instruments in the lower or lowest portion of their range. In fact, Symphony No. 5 starts with clarinets very much in the low range, and Symphony No. 6 starts with solo bassoon, also very much in its low range. Here's the beautiful oboe melody from the beginning of the second movement of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. So that's two complete statements of the same melody. This idea of repetition being a little repetitive, but you get the idea. So 4 distinct types of melodies, beautiful lyrical melodies that are really unable to be developed, march-like melodies, waltz-like melodies, and last but certainly not least, Russian folk melodies that are going to appear throughout Tchaikovsky's works. 2 other things to be aware of with Tchaikovsky. Frequently within the symphonies and other orchestral works, he'll use the wind instruments to provide energy and motion as accompaniment. It'll be repeated notes. In the case of the 5th Symphony, the second movement, there's a long string of triplets where the horns and eventually the woodwinds are constantly playing against the beautiful wind string melody. Very awkward to play because of the rubato. Da 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 da. We're just picking up speed, losing speed, and having to go along with the melody. There's also a very challenging excerpt in the first movement of the 6th Symphony where the horns have a strong syncopation that goes on for a very long span of time, where they're expected to sort of be able to deal with a little bit of rubato that the rest of the ensemble is doing. And the other thing I'd like to point out is that Tchaikovsky used a size of orchestra that was very similar to Brahms, which means that it really has not grown extensively. Generally speaking, pairs of wind instruments. He does tend to use 2 flutes along with a 3rd flute part for piccolo, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons. 4 horns were certainly the norm, as were 2 or 3 trumpets, as well as 3 trombones and a tuba. Now, with that said, or with those instruments, Tchaikovsky also uses timpani regularly, and in a style that's sometimes referred to as Russian festival style. If we think of the end of the Rimsky-Korsakov Russian Easter Overture, even the end of Mussorgsky's pictures of an exhibition. The idea of all kinds of things being used to really create a racket. Lots of cymbals and additional percussion, snare drum, bass drum, in some cases tambourine. That's one area where Tchaikovsky will expand the orchestra as opposed to Brahms, but generally speaking, the forces are not really that large. Certainly not as large as we're going to see later on with Strauss, Bruckner, and eventually particularly Mahler. There is one other thing, though, to be aware of. Tchaikovsky wasn't satisfied with just the idea of piano, forte, pianissimo, fortissimo, 1F, 2F, 1P, 2Ps. He'll actually push the envelope all the way to 6 in some instances. I'm not sure what the difference between 6 and 2 is. I guess it's this time I really mean it, whether it's really loud or really soft, but you get the general idea. We're going to turn our attention to the 4th Symphony, and as I've already mentioned, this work was completed in 1878. And at the very beginning of the video, I mentioned that Tchaikovsky's life was one that was really marred by a great deal of tragedy and conflict. As a result of his suppressed sexuality, the fact that he was essentially hiding himself from the world, he was put into an emotional state that's very difficult to relate to. And it was in the period of 1876, at the very end of 1876, that an unusual character entered his life, and that was Nadezhda von Meck, and she was a very wealthy widow who reached out to Tchaikovsky out of a great deal of appreciation and respect, and really a great deal of love, and insisted we must never leave, we must never meet. But she also became essentially his benefactress. And this created a period of time where Tchaikovsky experienced financial security that he had almost never experienced prior to that. For whatever reason, in 1877, he decided to, perhaps to appease his father, he decided to give in to the advances of a former student of his and agreed to marry. Now, it sounds as if Tchaikovsky tried to make clear to her the extent of which their relationship would exist. It doesn't seem that she was maybe willing to hear that, and the wedding was a disaster. This was actually the second great tragedy of Tchaikovsky's life. In fact, it lasted for just a matter of a few weeks weeks before Tchaikovsky just abandoned. And this was really the second tragedy of his life. So it's interesting that the beginning of the Fourth Symphony was written, and much of the Fourth Symphony was after meeting Nadezhda von Meck, prior to actually to the wedding that would be so tragic for him. So much of the orchestration occurs during a time of stability. And the work starts with a great outcry. And I want you to hear the very beginning of the Fourth Symphony. So that's the beginning and the announcement of a motive that Tchaikovsky himself would refer to as fate. Well, I mentioned Beethoven in the beginning of the Fifth Symphony a few moments ago, and the idea of hearing a brass statement that is so powerful and so loud in the hands of Tchaikovsky is going to take on a very different life. In the hands of Beethoven, that opening motive is turned into a much larger work. In the hands of Tchaikovsky, it becomes something that he'll return to from time to time. Now, the rest of that first movement is one of the more expansive, pretty much sonata form movements that Tchaikovsky would write. And in fact, when writing to his patroness von Meck, he referred to the first movement as clearly the best of the four movements. But I think it's really quite important that we turn our attention to the last movement, which we'll do in just a moment. That first movement has beautiful melodies that represent lyrical melodies, folk melodies, and a waltz-like melody, but they have very little in common with each other, and it can prove to be a very disorienting experience, if quite enjoyable, to listen to the first movement. We've already touched upon the second movement with its beautiful oboe solo. The third movement, as I've mentioned, is largely for pizzicato strings with some very boisterous solo woodwind writing. But we're going to turn our attention to the last movement, which will be our required listening. Still doesn't seem very dramatic. I don't know that Tchaikovsky would love the idea of us requiring the last movement of this symphony as the required listening, but I think for all intents and purposes, it's a really great snapshot into how Tchaikovsky's style worked, and I think it's very representative on many levels of what we need to understand about Tchaikovsky. So the work starts with a huge crash and an explosion, and we're going to introduce in really quite quick succession three different melodic ideas. Okay, we've got descending scales, and then we have a folk melody that's going to be established by the winds. And then that is going to return to the opening material before we actually get into our B section. So we'll have A1, A2, a return to A1, and the B section, which I'll identify for you. So that was the entire first part of the last movement of Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony. And as you saw over the course of that video, following the A material, B material, and the A material again, we have a long development of the A2 material. It's a Russian folk song, and Tchaikovsky is developing simply by changing the orchestration as well as some of the material that surrounds the melody. Well, scholars have argued over what the best way to talk about the form for this movement for generations, and I don't think we're going to change that today. I would suggest that this is a three-part form. You just heard all of the first part, and the second part is going to do largely what the first one did. A material, B material, a return to the A material, which is then developed. The difference is the second section is going to end by going into a very, very different place. So at the very end of that second section, the third section starts by returning to the material from the very beginning of the whole symphony. This idea of fate. Not so much knocking on the door, in the words of Beethoven, or knocking on the window, but maybe just barging through the front door. So following that, the music dies down, and we eventually start the final component of this. Very much a coda. We have the horns performing the B material, Yum Dum the Muffin Man, as I like to think of it. From there all the way up to a very exciting Russian festival style closing. And in all of the orchestral literature, I don't think there's a single piece that has more cymbal crashes than you're about to hear. So there you have it, Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, final movement. Tchaikovsky himself, great Russian romantic composer, famous for his orchestration, famous for his beautiful melodies, 4 different types, and a very important composer in the history of 19th century music. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.